Mike Owens with Inside Fighting, joined today by, in my opinion, one of the greatest fight analysts in the game, one half of the award-winning Morning Combat, Luke Thomas. Luke, always a pleasure. How are things? It's good to catch up.
It's good to see you again, and things are great. Obviously, we got a busy fight calendar coming up, so I'm pretty excited about that.
Before we talk about the future, I just wanted to get maybe your key highlight in the sport or in MMA or maybe even in boxing for the first half of 2025. What comes to mind in terms of a fight, a fighter, or something that will stick in your memory?
The ascendance of Ilia Topuria, far and away. Obviously, much of what has made him turn a corner was done in 2024, but the last piece of that, getting the second title, was more recently. But he's been doing interesting things for a while, and MMA hasn't really. I don't know how big he'll ultimately become as a star. That remains to be seen. But just in terms of a talent that is tearing through a division like this, you don't see him very often. The John Joneses at light heavyweight, the Khabibs at lightweight, even Conor McGregor as well. And it just doesn't happen very often. So when it does, a shooting star in the sky, it's important to watch.
I had the pleasure of being in the T-Mobile a couple of weeks ago for that fight, first ever international fight week, and it certainly felt in the moment like, I was at a piece of history. Did you feel like that watching at home, like in years to come, that will be a kind of shining moment that people will look back on?
There's simply no question when you're watching a guy like, at this point it's undeniable that when you're watching a guy like Ilia Topuria, you're watching MMA history.
Mm.
I just try to explain it to people. It's like, for I've been watching this sport a long time, and people have asked, like, what was it like when John Jones was tearing through? And there's always going to be meaningful differences. It's never one to one, but it was like this. It was like this. It was just one legend lined up after the other. And you think, okay, well, this one will be a little bit different, and that one will be a little bit harder. And certainly Max gave him a couple of very competitive rounds, but in general, like they all, I mean, in reality, they all seem to end the same way. It was like this: watching someone tear through MMA's top talent like they're nothing. It felt like that. And so whenever you see something like that happening, you are watching something that's going to stand the test of time.
Do you make the Paddy Pimblett fight next for Ilya?
I think you could. I think
Mm.
you could. I don't think that would be a scandal if you did. I think you could. I don't think that's the it's not the right call for me, in part because I think if you gave Patty one more fight first, um, that would be fair to his development as well as the building of the fight. On top of that, I do think Saryukian's case for a title shot's a little bit stronger. However, you could do it. And in fact, one of the arguments that you might want to do it now is that if you delay and you delay, Topuria could lose,
Yeah.
Patty could lose, or you could set it up one guy gets injured. Things can fall apart in MMA very, very easily. So this is what I mean. Like if they pulled the trigger on that, you might say it's a little early, and it could be. But at the same time, with what I'll say with Ilya is whether Islam is next, whether it is Armin next, whether it is Patty next, there really isn't a wrong answer. There's ones that are more right, but there's not really any of them that are wrong.
How big is that fight, the Ilya and Paddy fight, in your mind? And the reason why I asked that question is I come at this from a biased perspective because Paddy comes from 4 or 5 miles away from my house, so it's difficult for me to compute how big of a star Paddy is. But in your mind, if that fight was made in the next, let's say, 6 to 12 months, where does that rank in terms of the biggest fight in the sport history? Because both guys certainly say, it could potentially be the biggest.
Sports history is harder to say.
Mm.
I certainly think it's one of the bigger fights UFC can make,
Yeah,
independent of weight class, right? I mean, that's you've got a guy who's now, well, he's only one champ, but he's been essentially is a double champ in that sense, right? Two
yeah,
different weight classes. And then you've got a guy who is perceived to be his top rival, who has been something of a celebrated figure, maybe even longer than Topuria has, to be quite honest.
mm.
And they hate each other. It would be a clash of different worlds. But you know, it's how healthy is MMA relative to how it was 10 years ago? It's a little harder to say. I would just, to me, the way I would answer that is
Mm.
that fight would be a big deal. It would be certainly a promotional home run. And I do think there's a question of where you put it. I don't think they would put it in Europe, even though it would make a lot of sense to put it there. You could put it in Spain. You could even put it in England. I doubt that they would put Topuria in England to fight Patty, or that he would even accept such a thing. So that seems unlikely, although I think you would probably agree that would make the fight, enormous in that particular way.
Certainly would.
But it's definitely a huge fight. And I'm going to say it again, one of the bigger fights that they can make independent of weight class.
Yeah, 100%. Saturday night, we see the last dance for the Diamond, Dustin Poirier versus Max Holloway, the trilogy fight. What is your level of excitement for the UFC 318 main event?
I would say it's pretty high, but maybe a little one-sided in terms of where my intrigue is. I mean, if you believe Dustin Poirier, and I'm inclined to do so, he says, this is it. When I'm done, I'm done. I'm not going to come back out, and that's it. So it's like there's a story to monitor there in terms of how does his career end? What does it look like if it ends on a win? How do we view it if it ends on a loss? How do we view it? And that's not irrelevant. But Max is like eyeing life well after this one. And he is coming off of a loss, a terrible one, maybe the worst one of his career. I mean, again, it was a competitive 2 rounds, but the nature of how it ended,
Mm,
pretty dramatic.
yeah.
And this is, as he indicated, if he loses this one, he goes 0-6. Like to me, the intrigue is like, what kind of Max are we going to get, and what does that do for his future, considering that there still is one, right? Dustin doesn't, by his own admission, doesn't have one, not as a fighter anyway, obviously.
Yes.
So I would say I'm very intrigued, but I'm much more intrigued by the Max Holloway side of the equation, both in terms of what he'll give and then ultimately how that plays out for the rest of that lightweight division as well as his career.
Are you anticipating any major changes in Max's style post Ilia Topuria defeat?
Post Ilia Topuria, no, no. But it's so funny, man. I knew we'd talk about it, so I really wanted to make this point today to your audience.
Mm,
When Max fought Dustin, forget about the first time when both guys were just completely different guys.
yeah,
But when Max fought Dustin the second time, I don't know if folks remember this. Max was still the featherweight champ. He was trying to go up. In fact, after he lost to Poirier, he went back down to featherweight, defended against Frankie Edgar. And we kind of associate mentally peak Max with that time. After all, he was the champion at that time, and he was obviously very good, stopping Jose Aldo in back-to-back fights. Prior to that, and I don't think that's unfair in terms of like your memory. But like I went back and I watched the second fight, and I couldn't believe what I was looking at. Like if you just compare that Max, both in terms of his physical development as well as his skill set, to the guy that fought Justin Gaethje at 55. Dude, it's borderline unrecognizable. I couldn't
mm,
believe how much difference there was. He looked. I know this for a fact. When he went up to 55 that time against Dustin for their second fight, they basically just did the same thing they did to make the cut to 45, and just did less of it. They
yeah.
didn't actually bulk up to 55 in the right way. You go look at him against 55 against Gaethje, and he did do it the right way. And you can see there's a huge difference in his muscle mass. Don't take my word for it. Go look at this fight and look at Max. He has a little bit of like, he has no abs. He has a little bit of loose skin, not
Yeah.
loose skin, but like a little bit. For an athlete, I'm talking
It
about.
doesn't look like a super brutal weight cut, is what you're trying to
No,
say.
far from it. It
Yeah,
looks like he could, you can tell that the guy was fighting at featherweight at that time. Is what point
yeah.
I'm trying to make. And the other part is like his skill set is so much more raw, including in the striking, not just the other parts of it. I could not believe how different it was. Well, I got to tell you, like nothing would surprise me about Dustin Poirier. He can win this one, no problem. He's already won two. What would stop him from winning a third? But I think this is a very, very different Max. The thing you asked though was about Post-Topuria. The only question I have is not a difference in style so much, but what did the knockout do to him? Does it change him psychologically? Did it crack his chin where he's not as vulnerable anymore because Dustin is a big puncher? I think that's kind of what I'm focusing on.
You've often, as someone who consumes a lot of your content, you've often had a concern about Max's durability and maybe the idea that once it goes, it maybe can't go back. How much of a concern, if that's a correct assumption, how much of a concern is that going into this fight?
The thing about Max, it's a fair assumption. The thing about Max is that, he has proven to be insanely durable. So these
Mm,
questions about his durability makes it seem like I'm being a nervous Nelly and,
yeah,
getting too far ahead of myself. I think partly what I would say in response to that is, there might be something to that, but more I'm just thinking like long-term health. Yeah, has his chin been cracked in a way where we can say definitively he's not the same anymore? We don't know. Obviously Taporia put him down, but let's see how he rebounds, right? So it may not necessarily be the case. Although, Topuria might have ruined him too. Like that's the thing.
Yeah,
You just, you have to at least confront that question. I'm not giving an answer, but I am saying it's a question you cannot. Oh, we don't have to worry about that.
yeah.
You do a little bit actually. But he just fights in a way where he puts himself in the line of fire all the time, and we know this. Like he invites it. Like he is celebrated for it. You just have to wonder. Like he's not fighting chumps. He's fighting heavy hitters, fight after fight after. I mean, literally, he's going from Gaethje to Topuria back to Poirier. I mean, all three of those guys are vicious punchers. And that's a ridiculously difficult task. So to say nothing of that, the guy's style just puts himself right in the line of fire. And I'm not saying he's got bad defense, he's got good defense, but you need to have, excellent defense to just walk out of there halfway yourself. There are big questions about his durability. And I know I've said that a million times and it
Mm.
hasn't shown up, but we're getting longer in the tooth now. He's left 45. He left off of a bad KO loss. Like the concern in my judgment is not idle.
You might argue across the featherweight and lightweight division, he's fought the three biggest punches back to back to back. That's a assumption somebody could make.
Given who's out there, you could actually make. I mean, I don't think that's in any way a crazy statement, And obviously,
Mm.
he's held his own, and I'm sure win or lose, he'll hold his own on Saturday. But you understand my point, right? Like
Yeah,
he's not fighting. He's not going from like good fighter to good fighter, striker to grappler. It's
yeah.
striker, 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 and heavy-handed ones at that.
Turning the conversation towards Dustin, this is a unique scenario. I mean, we've seen throughout history the fighters sometimes get the opportunity to retire in their hometown or their home state. But as a main event with a symbolic title on the line, it does feel like there's an element of grandiose to this last fight for Dustin. My question to you is, how often should this be the case? Like, should Max Holloway be given the opportunity to retire in Hawaii? Should Charles Oliveira be given the opportunity to retire in Sao Paulo? Should Alexander Volkanovski be given the opportunity to retire in New South Wales, for example? How rare or often should this be for the legends of the sport?
I don't think it should be rare at all, but I would say that to me, um, there's a bit of a different question here about terms of where you retire. Like some of the very greats in boxing don't necessarily retire in their hometowns
Mm.
either.
Yeah,
Um, and so it's not that I think that has to happen for that reason, but what I would say is, and Dustin has fought previously in Louisiana, um, but what I would say is big fights during the height of their career need to be in their hometown. To me, that's actually the much more important one. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm very glad that this is. If you've been to New Orleans, you ever been down
never
there?
been to New Orleans, no.
Yeah. So
Would
like
love
the
to.
the arena where he's fighting is like I mean a stone's throw away from the Superdome, which is essentially downtown. Like it's all right there. So it's going to be a grand atmosphere. Make no mistake about it. New Orleans is good at many things. Partying is probably one of one of the top ones, and it's all kind of for the most part all located down there. But I guess the bigger issue for me is guys who are in the peaks of their career, who are the defending titles in particular, they should be fighting. I know what the UFC does, right? Like they set a calendar. We're going to go to Liverpool. We're going to go to Vancouver. We're going to go to Miami or whatever, and
Mm.
then they kind of just fill in the places, the gaps there, and that has worked for them. Like it's not like it's a failed strategy or something, but like who's it successful for? It's successful for UFC. I don't know that it necessarily serves the fighters' interests as much. And my personal hope would be that, like, as we move along, God, I don't know how you can't do this for everybody. Obviously, it's not going to work
Of
out. I mean,
course.
how do you do it for Islam? And you could go to Russia, but
Yeah,
if you go, it's not
logistically, it doesn't work for every single
exactly.
guy, of
It's
course.
not gonna. It's not 100% thing. But
Yeah.
in the case of guys like Dustin, who are in New Orleans or Max in Honolulu, like should Max have a fight in Honolulu? Max should have already had a UFC fight in Honolulu. That's what would be good for Max. And if Max was a boxer, I guarantee you would have seen it already.
Mm.
So that to me is the issue. Not so much the retirement, but at their peak, getting to be a king among their people, like Jose Aldo got to do against Chad Mendez in Rio.
Do you like when fighters announce that this is going to be the last fight and we all kind of know ahead of time that this is the last one? Or do you subscribe to the theory of if you've got one foot out the door, then you should get out of the sport?
I would say in general, if you got one foot out the door, you should go. I think in the case of Dustin, he lost to Makachev, but it's not like he didn't put Makachev through the paces. Like he still looks pretty good.
Mm.
You know, he still looks like a competitive, high level lightweight. This far into his career, so for him, I think it gives him actually a little bit of additional purpose rather than in my judgment, he could lose certainly on Saturday, but he's not limping to the finish line.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times guys are, they're saying this at the end, and then they're in a state of their career where like they're just barely hanging on. That's really not the case with Dustin. I mean, he's got a formidable challenge, but no, I'm okay with it in this particular case.
How much does the result and a potential win again of the symbolic BMF title, how much, and obviously this is result dependent, but how much does a win affect Dustin's legacy on Saturday?
I don't think it actually affects it much one way or the
Mm.
other. Um, he his biggest achievements are almost exclusively behind him. Now you could argue beating Max a third time for a BMF title would be one of his bigger accomplishments, and I wouldn't challenge that. But what I would say is, to me, if he imagine something happens between now and Saturday and he can't fight, his legacy is kind of already written, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's wrong to call UFC 318 a formality. I think what I would say is if he goes out on a win on Saturday, to me it would be yes another great thing on his resume, but to me it would just kind of serve as a reminder that he was competitive this late in his career, but more to the point that like was he the very best lightweight of his generation? No, but he was clearly one of the very best lightweights of his generation with insane durability, fight stopping power throughout the course of it, and a guy who found a way to maximize achievement despite not being the very best and gave every one of his generation, I think, with maybe the exception of Habib, more or less all they could handle. And that is one hell of a legacy. So it doesn't ride on Max Holloway, but
Yeah.
I think ending with that kind of an achievement really solidifies that position. Yeah.
Do you believe in the do you believe there's often this list of fighters who are listed as the greatest fighters to never win a UFC title? Where do you think Dustin ranks on that list of the likes of your Dan Hendersons, Uriah Fabers, so on and so forth?
High. Now,
Mm.
Dan Henderson to me is separate from that. I mean, your point is correct. He didn't, but the fact that he had two titles at once in Pride to me kind of, in my judgment, puts him alongside the other ones. I
Yeah.
mean, I watched live when he knocked out Vanderlei Silva. Like that was a big deal. That
Yeah.
was a really big deal. So I'd put him there. But to answer the question, where would I put him? I mean, at the very top. If not number one, top three. I mean, he's just an exceptional talent. He just happened to be at a time where at 45 he wasn't fully himself. Obviously, McGregor played a role there. At 55, I do think you got the best of him. I do think that's right. And then it just so happened at the time, here comes Habib Nurmagomedov, who is a generational talent. I mean, what can you do? It's like Gustafson. Gustafson's going to be another one of
Yeah.
these guys. Alexander Gustafson, like man, he gave Cormier all he could handle. He gave John Jones in that first fight anyway all he could handle. What do you do when like there's a generational talent and then a former Olympian who also is like
Mm.
just like an amazing fighter? It sucks. Because he wasn't far apart. There's not at the times he fought them. The gap. How big was the gap between them? Minimal.
Yeah.
He nearly knocked out Cormier, if you recall. So
Yeah.
he's on. Faber also had a title in WEC, if memory serves.
Yeah, he did.
Before, yeah, I think Mike Thomas Brown took it from him. So, I also kind of consider that a title. Poirier is a little different because he never held, in my view, a full-on weight class title at a major organization at any point. But if you count that, he's very, 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 very high on that list.
I couldn't agree more. Before I let you go, I wanted to talk about one more man because Conor McGregor's back in the news with some leaked images that he's been sending to some celebrity that I'd never heard of. What do you make of the latest McGregor scandal? It feels like the nickname Notorious is starting to turn the other way and maybe go from a positive into a negative.
I mean, it's been a negative for me for quite some time. I mean, even if you wanted to hold out judgment, everything that happened after that court case to me was enough to
Well,
make
that's
that
very
judgment.
true.
He's a terrible person. He's a terrible person. And listen, the reality is in combat sports, there's a lot of terrible people of varying degrees. And people always like, what about Iron Mike? Iron Mike did, Tyson did a lot of bad stuff. And it's true, but it's like Mike went to jail. Like Mike had to serve a sentence that the government imposed on him, and he had to go do that thing. And then he had to, um, he converted to Islam. And I know he had some wild times after that, but in general has been, I don't think he was the same person after jail. I think I'd be very clear about that. Like there was some level of having to answer to the public for his literal crimes. McGregor just seems to skate. His significant other doesn't seem to do anything about it. UFC doesn't seem to do anything about it. Law enforcement does something about it, but very little, relatively speaking. He's a bad guy, and I know some folks don't care about that kind of thing. I understand. Some folks are, they look the other way. If he never fought again, I'd be totally fine.
Is there a point where the sport of MMA or the fans of MMA wash their hands with Conor McGregor, or can he do kind of no, can he do, you know, anything he wants essentially, and up until that return date is announced, people will, give him a free pass and look forward to the next fight.
I mean, I would say that unless he does some kind of heinous crime, the answer there's probably not much he can do almost whatever. What I would say though is it's less about the fans like all of a sudden turning on him, and it's more about the thing that's already been in motion for quite some time, which is the slow kind of letting go of him, the
Mm.
slow irrelevance of him, at least as a fighter, right? I mean, I guess he's got some BKFC stuff going on, and that's not nothing. There is actually a little something to that, but in terms of just like a thing that you can be like, oh, when's he gonna be back, and what could be next for him? Already, fans have just kind of like I mean, you could used to be able to make videos endlessly like who should McGregor fight next. These aren't even relevant questions anymore, and I think there's still a little bit of hope holding out, obviously, with what could happen next July 4th here in the United States, but in general, like the people are just slowly letting him go. I think you might get more of that as time proceeds.
Last question on this. What would you imagine a Conor McGregor fight week to look like now? Like when we think about the Khabib Conor fight week, it was so dull, the fight build up, never mind the fight week. It was so dark. It went to a place that the sport maybe hadn't seen before, and it was so serious and so, again, dark is the word that's come to mind. What would you anticipate a McGregor fight week to look like now? Again, it's the question is opponent dependent, but what would you imagine it to look like?
Like what you saw against Eddie Alvarez or even some other folks he had antagonism towards, but just a shittier version of it. You know what I mean? Just a much less, the jokes are less interesting. The humor's a little darker. Stuff doesn't hit quite as well. There's accusations, like kind of what you see from what he does at BKFC to a degree, although he's not really the target there in that sense. But just 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 the gutter that he brings with him, to be honest with you. So there is a market for that. We should be honest about that. There is a market for that. That's not in terms of the fight sport world. That's not. There are worse things actually, but the high highs or these like the soaring rhetoric that used to surround him when he was doing interesting stuff. That's all dead. That's going to stay dead. I think what you're going to get is just what you get now, which is you know malfeasance and all the things downstream from it.
Luke, thank you for your time as always. It's always a pleasure. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the insights. Enjoy some time off. I know you said that you're off camera, you're going on a holiday. Enjoy some time off, and I look forward to speaking to you again later on this year, my friend.
Anytime. Thank you.